Welcome to The Explainer, everyone. I am so incredibly thrilled to be your guide today as we unpack what is honestly a fascinating literary journey. We're diving deep into the genesis and the evolution of the Elizabethan sonnet. Think of it as a masterclass in kavithai, that profound, passionate poetry crashing right into structural math. It's this wild mix of raw, overwhelming emotion and precise, almost rigid architectural design. So, let's jump right in.
I want you to think about this for a second. Can you capture the absolute entirety of human love and heartbreak in exactly 14 lines? No way, right? It sounds totally impossible. I mean, how do you take the sweeping, overwhelming emotion of deep coddle, true love, and squish it into such a tiny, strict box? Well, spoiler alert, these sonneteers did exactly that. They turned those 14 lines into the ultimate vessel for the highest peaks and the lowest valleys of human emotion. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of how they actually made this work, we really need to see where it all started.
So, here's our syllabus for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the birth of the sonnet, then its journey crossing the English Channel. Next, we'll dive into Surrey and the structural evolution, followed by the Elizabethan sonnet craze. And finally, we'll wrap things up with Shakespeare's timeless mastery.
All right, part 1, the birth of the sonnet. Let's travel back to the 14th century Italian Renaissance.
To understand this giant emotional puzzle, we gotta ask, what exactly is a sonnet? Simply put, it's a 14-line lyric poem designed to express the speaker's most intense personal feelings. Now, it was originally introduced by Dante, but it was a poet named Petrarch who really took it mainstream. Petrarch wrote these incredibly moving poems directed at his beloved, Laura. He was basically pouring his heart out on the page, and in doing so, he established the sonnet as the absolute go-to format for expressing unrequited love and longing. That was the original blueprint.
Moving right along to part 2, crossing the English Channel.
So our timeline kicks off in the 14th century with Petrarch over in Italy. Fast forward to the 15th century, and you have these English scholars traveling to Italy, totally soaking up the Renaissance vibes and bringing this beautiful poetic form right back home to England. Actually, a poet named Thomas Wyatt was the very first guy to write sonnets in English, and he was super strict about it. He followed Petrarch's exact Italian structure to the letter. But, well, the English language is a bit different, and it soon demanded a few structural changes.
Which brings us to part 3, Surrey and structural evolution.
Okay, pay attention here, because this is the major turning point of our story. This is where the math really comes into play. The Earl of Surrey looked at that classic Italian form and thought, you know what, let's fundamentally rewire the DNA of this poem. See, the Italian sonnet was an 8+6 problem solution format. You had an octave, 8 lines presenting a problem, a pause called a caesura, and then a sestet, 6 lines giving the resolution. The rhyme scheme was tight, ABBA, ABBA, CDC, DCD. But Surrey realized that didn't really fit the natural rhythm of English, so he brilliantly shifted the math from an 8+6 format to a 12+2 format. He broke those first 12 lines into 3 quatrains, groups of 4, and finished the whole thing off with a punchy 2-line rhyming couplet. The new English rhyme scheme, ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, GG. It totally changed the game for how a poem builds an argument and delivers a final, satisfying knockout punch.
And all of this structural genius culminated in a massive publication in 1557 called Tottel's Miscellany. It was a groundbreaking collection of songs and sonnets by Wyatt and Surrey, and honestly, you cannot overstate how important this book is. It was literally the spark that ignited the entire English sonnet tradition. It put this brand new English structure on the map for all the future greats to study and use.
Now let's step into part 4, the Elizabethan sonnet craze.
During the Elizabethan era, writing these poems became an absolute cultural obsession. And out of that came the sonnet sequence. What is that? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. A massive collection of sonnets all addressed to a single lady. These poets weren't just writing one-offs. They were writing dozens, sometimes well over 100 poems, tracking the entire emotional roller coaster of a relationship. It became a highly defining feature of the era's poetry.
Let's meet some of our main cast members, starting with Sir Philip Sidney. He was pretty much the ultimate Elizabethan gentleman, a courtier, a poet, and tragically, a soldier who was killed at the Battle of Zutphen. He left us this incredible sequence called Astrophel and Stella, which has 108 sonnets. What's fascinating is that Sidney actually stuck to the older Italian form to express his true, raw emotion for Penelope. The sequence was published after he died in 1591, and it absolutely exploded in popularity.
Then you have Edmund Spenser. While Sidney was all about unrequited love, Spenser took a totally different route.
He wrote a sequence of 88 sonnets called Amoretti, but get this, he actually addressed them to the woman he married, Elizabeth Boyle. He even celebrated their wedding in his famous poem, Epithalamion. Structurally, Spenser was a total innovator. He took the English sonnet and tweaked the math again, creating this beautifully interlocking rhyme scheme, ABAB, BCBC, CDCD, EE. It's like a flowing chain of rhymes that fit his romantic narrative perfectly.
Just to show you how huge this craze was, let's look at two other massively popular sonneteers at the time, Samuel Daniel and Michael Drayton. Daniel wrote a sequence called Delia, and played totally by the rules, strictly following Surrey's English tradition. Drayton, on the flip side, wrote a sequence called Idea, which was super famous for its free-flowing, almost spontaneous inspiration. It's amazing to see how both men took the exact same 14-line constraint and produced completely different vibes.
Speaking of Drayton, he actually penned one of the most famous opening lines of the entire era, "Since there's no help." Just think about that. It instantly grabs you, right? It totally captures the longing and those extreme emotional peaks of the era. You can feel the sheer heartbreak packed into just those 4 words, perfectly contained within the math of the poem.
And that brings us to the climax of our literary drama, Part 5, Shakespeare's Timeless Mastery.
Look, we literally cannot talk about the Elizabethan sonnet without bowing down to the undisputed master. And the sheer, monumental scale of Shakespeare's contribution really just comes down to one powerful number, 154.
That's right. Shakespeare wrote a staggering 154 sonnets. But unlike his peers, he wasn't just writing to one idealized woman. His sequences are addressed to 2 main figures, a fair youth known as WH and the infamous Dark Lady. Shakespeare took Surrey's English pattern, the 3 quatrains and a couplet, and absolutely perfected it. By sticking to that ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, GG structure, he used those last 2 lines as a dramatic mic drop, summarizing or even twisting everything that came before. And honestly, the themes and relationships in these poems are so complex that they've sparked intense critical debate for centuries.
So, what does this all mean for us? Well, the legacy of these sonneteers is that they managed to capture the absolute extremes of love. They permanently cast the lover as this ardent worshiper, placing the object of their affection on an impossibly high pedestal. It was such a powerful idea that it spread like wildfire and thrived long after Shakespeare was gone, fundamentally changing English literature forever.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to end on. By placing love on such an unreachable pedestal, how did the strict math of these 14-line poems permanently shape our modern ideas of romance? Seriously, the next time you listen to a pop love song or watch a rom-com, ask yourself, are you just seeing the legacy of the Elizabethan sonnet playing out on screen? I really hope this explainer sparked your curiosity to go check out some of these timeless verses for yourself. Thanks so much for hanging out and learning with me today.